Let's listen to the little people telling us what they want to see. Let's listen to the community when they say that this is wrong, this is offensive, this is perpetuating harmful stereotypes, which the community has been trying to challenge and change.
Welcome to The Wheelchair Activist, a podcast hosted by me, Emma Vogelman, and every month I interview amazing members and allies of the disabled community who are quite literally changing the world. In this episode, I am chatting to the amazing Jillian Curwin. Jillian is the host of a podcast called Always Looking Up, which I highly recommend you check out. Now, let's jump into this really interesting conversation. Jillian, thank you for joining me to open season 3 of my podcast, The Wheelchair Activist. It is such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. Congrats on season 3. And I'm honored that you chose me to open this new season.
As a seasoned podcaster with over 100 episodes under your belt, I'm excited to chat to you about all things disability representation, fashion, and of course, what is disability like in America. And that's
Mhm.
something that we haven't really talked a huge amount on this podcast before because other than my childhood best friend, all of my guests have largely been from the UK, and we've never really delved into what it is to be a disabled person in the States, other than my own experience because I grew up there. But yeah, really interested to get into all of those things. But could you give a little intro to our audience on who you are, what you do, and all that good stuff?
So, my name is Jillian Curwin. I am a little person with dwarfism. Dwarf, all of the above are acceptable terms. I'm just a person of short stature. I have shorter arms and legs, supporting an average height torso. And like you said, I am a podcaster. So, I have like a daily 9 to 5, like kind of corporate job. And then I am the host of the podcast, Always Looking Up, where I talk to other people in the dwarfism community, as well as people in the disability community, those that are disability adjacent, as well as those who are allies to the community, about living in a world that is not necessarily designed for us. I also write, I have a blog, which has been a bit of a hiatus for the moment, but I'm hoping to bring back this year. I have a couple ideas for pieces I want to write. I also do some freelance work talking about different events happening and how they relate to the disability community, whether that's in pop culture, real life, etc.
Tell me about Always Looking Up. Like, what made you want to start your podcast?
So, Always Looking Up the podcast came from a series I was doing on my blog, also entitled Always Looking Up. And the blog I had started in January of 2020. I've always been interested in fashion and finding ways to speak up about, but wasn't necessarily calling myself an advocate yet. But seeing, and so in 2019, Sinead Burke was featured on the cover of British Vogue as one of the 15 forces for change. I was able to get my hands on that issue. And I remember seeing it for the first time in fashion, which is an industry I love, but doesn't include me. I felt seen. Here's someone in the UK doing this. I always wanted to, but never thought I could because I didn't see anybody like me really doing it. I had a lot to learn about being an advocate in the disability space, what the disability rights movement was. I really didn't know. And we can go into that. And then that kind of will play into like the differences between the US and the UK a little bit. But I was like, I'm going to do this. So I started the blog, and in the beginning, so January 2020 was when I launched it, and it was purely from a fashion focus. So it's talking about trying to find jeans and looking at the Oscar looks and seeing, could this dress theoretically work on a little person where you wouldn't lose the dress? Same thing with Fashion Week and talking about the lack of dwarfism representation. And so, like, very much from a fashion lens. And then COVID hit. And obviously, the fashion industry, like many others, shut down. And I didn't know what to write about. And so the only logical answer was to start writing about other issues outside of fashion. And through that, I think that's where my disability education came in because I didn't really identify as disabled. This is also around the time when Crip Camp came out, and everybody was talking about that within the community. And I learned a lot about our history that wasn't taught in schools. So getting that education, and one of the things then at the time, like I wanted to do was talk to other people because we were all so isolated and so spread out. So I started this series on my blog called Girl Talk, where I would, like as we're doing right now, have a Zoom interview with a friend. I talked to people in the dwarfism community. I remember talking to one of my best friends who is a fashion designer and was designing for disability in the disability design space. I would then transcribe our conversations, try to edit them down as best I could without losing what was being said and publishing it. And I loved the conversations I was having. I didn't love the process of the transcribing. And at the time, because I think we were missing their voice for me, I was like, I want their voice to come through. Having that transcription is very important, but I still felt like something was missing. And so I was like, why don't I start a podcast? Nobody was in that space that I really saw doing it. I reached out to my younger brother who was majoring in radio, television, and film at Northwestern. I said, hey, would you want to do this? I know you had this technical skill. And he said, sure. So that was the easiest yes I was ever able to get out of my brother for help.
Oh my God. As someone with a brother, I hear you.
Yeah. So May 2021, we launched the podcast and it's been a wild ride. I love doing it. I'm proud of the growth, the conversations that I've been able to have. And this year, I really just want to keep doing more and more with it.
There's so many things about what you said that I want to ask you about. But first thing is when you talked about fashion, and you said that it was a world that you loved, but it didn't include you. I really, really resonate with that. But that also just strikes me as something really profoundly sad that you can love this world and love this industry, but feel so excluded from it. I just want to know if you want to say a bit more about your relationship with fashion. If, as we all know, the fashion industry isn't inclusive to all types of disabled people.
Yeah. I think that whole concept of loving an industry but not feeling loved back or not being seen applies to a lot. It doesn't just apply to fashion. But for me, I think, my love for fashion has always been there. I remember when I was younger, there was a store limited to, and it was like the coolest
Oh
store.
my God, I spent hours
Y
in that
Yep.
store.
For young millennial girls in the early 2000s, it was the store, like that and Delia's. Those were the 2 top tier stores. And I remember the first time I was able to buy a shirt that fit me there, and it was just like a t-shirt. Like, that was a huge deal. I wore that as often as I could. And every time that I'd go to the mall and go shopping, I would look at the mannequins and try to copy their outfits to the best of my ability. And often what that meant was copying them from the waist up. And it wasn't something I truly recognized that I was doing, but it was something that I knew that from the waist up, more or less, I could replicate that outfit and try to be one of the cool girls or be on trend. The problem was, though, finding pants or finding shorts or finding skirts that fit me. I'm 28 years old, limited to sadly does not really exist. I don't think it exists anymore. I still have that problem though. There's that. And then I remember being in my parents' bedroom and because there was the only room in the upstairs that had a TV in it. And I was just like flipping through channels and I couldn't find the remote. So you had to hit the buttons on the screen. And there was no guy that tells you what channel you're on. I had stumbled across this fashion show. It was when they were doing the runway show. And I had no idea what show this was. But I was entranced. I was mesmerized. I could not believe that There's a show where people were getting judged on design. I had no clue what they were talking about in terms of fit, in terms of style, in terms of taste. I knew that I was like, I was, like, obsessed with it, and I couldn't find it for the longest time. I could not find that show again until I discovered it was Project Runway on Bravo. Bravo is the one of the guiltiest of guilty pleasures. So very thankful for
It's
Project
Purple.
Runway in many ways. But yeah, and since so watching that show and seeing the design process and how clothing is actually made, disability was never a client on Project Runway until relatively recently, and it was treated like a one-off. And but still just, like, seeing that, I think just, like, fueled this passion for fashion, and then growing up, obviously, like, trying to find jeans, trying to find clothes, trying to find prom dresses, trying to find shoes. That's kinda like the lens where I understood my disability, even though I didn't understand that I was disabled, was that nothing fit, that I didn't fit into this world. And that's kind of like why when I was, like, seeing Sinead Burke on the cover, like, that was my entry point into disability advocacy
Mhm.
was through fashion.
That's so interesting. I mean, weirdly, like I said, I grew up in the States and I grew up living in limited two with my friends. But the first time that I, as a wheelchair user, was able to wear jeans was when Limited 2 came out with an elasticated waistband jean.
Mhm.
So I really remember feeling like I felt so cool. I felt like I just felt like a normal teenager wearing jeans and a cute top. And it seems so insignificant to other people, but I really get what you mean about this sort of moment that you just want to be able to express yourself through your clothing, but
Yeah.
the fashion industry just doesn't allow us to do that.
Yeah, and it's I always look at jeans as, like, the example because I remember writing one of my earlier blog posts that I wrote was about, like, finally owning multiple pairs of jeans that fit me, which I really didn't do. I really had one pair of really good jeans that fit me that I liked, and then the others were like, they fit, but I didn't like the fit, but that was, like, the best that they were ever going to fit on my body. And it's the fashion industry, whether you consider yourself into it or not, it is one of the few industries that affect everyone, that truly affect and impact everyone because we all get dressed in the morning. We all have to put on clothes. And whether it's we want to be comfortable, whether we are like dressing to go to work, go to the gym, go wherever we're going, we have to get dressed for it. And disability, it's still, for the most part, left out. There's been strides since I first became interested in fashion, but for the most part, disability is still left out and isn't considered in that process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more when I have become more aware of fashion and designers, fashion weeks, etc. Anytime that there is a disabled person included, it does very much feel like a one-off, or sometimes it can feel quite tokenistic in a way,
Yeah.
which isn't real inclusivity. And so I think it's really impactful when, like you said, you saw Sinead Burke on a Vogue magazine cover, and I remember seeing her on the cover as well, and she was wearing this it was a really cute white, like, shirt dress,
Yep.
and I saw that it was from Alexander McQueen, which was is my favorite designer in the
I
entire world.
love Alexander McQueen. I
Ugh,
love
I
McQueen.
remind me after this to send you some pictures of these shoes that I just got for Christmas that were Alexander McQueen, and like, wait, this is so interesting though, right? That we're talking about this because
Yep.
I look at McQueen's clothing and I think, God, if I had a body where I could wear these pieces, I would wear nothing else. I would have zero money whatsoever, but it feels so unobtainable to me to wear those pieces. But when you find a piece of clothing, whether it's jewelry, whether it's shoes, bags, whatever it might be that fits you so well from a brand like that. It's so powerful, right?
Mhm.
And yeah, I'm so curious about what you've learned since doing a podcast about disability because exactly like you, I didn't call myself disabled for a really long time. And I think a huge part of that was growing up in America, which is a lot newer of a country, like relatively than the UK,
Yeah.
and is better for physical accessibility, at least from my perspective as a wheelchair user. But just sort of like, yeah, what has been your sort of disability discovery journey since maybe moving away from fashion a little bit?
I think it goes back to, again, when Crip Camp came out, and I that was in the summer of, I believe, like, 20, so I think it came out actually, like, in the winter of 2020 before COVID. I could be completely wrong about that. But it was, like, that summer I watched it, and I watched it because, oddly enough, Sinead was, like, posted, like, something like, "Wanna do, like, a group chat talking about this film." And so we all signed on, said hi, introduced ourselves, and then we all went to separately go watch the film, and then we all logged back on to talk about it. And I think I was the only American on the call. I could be wrong about that.
Mm,
And it was interesting for me to say because I remember, like, saying, like, at the time, like, I didn't know this. I felt ashamed as an American not to know, as an American with a disability, not to know this part of our history. And I think someone had asked, "Why, like, wasn't this taught in schools?" And I was like, "No, we never." Judy the
mm,
Human's name, just for the best of my memory, did not appear in a textbook. The 504 citizens was not something we studied. We didn't study the history of the ADA and how that came to be. And I think that was a real wake up call for me to say, there's a lot here that I don't know. I try to figure out, why don't I know this? Why wasn't this taught to me? Why don't I identify as disabled? Because I still didn't. It took me really to moving to New York City the next year and finding a group of friends that were differently disabled, that were wheelchair users, that use different mobility devices, and being a part of that community where I really started to say and embrace that I was disabled. So I think that's like the lens through which I studied disability, was talking to other people who weren't just little people and talking to them and understanding their experience, their access needs, and then seeing, we have things like, we have laws like the ADA and Section 504, and seeing how they're effective, but also how they are still 30 plus years later rather ineffective in protecting the right and truly like the bodies of disabled people in a way. One of the things I've been like exploring, wanting to talk about is like how we say that things, obviously since the ADA, like we say like it's great that we have it, but at the same time, is it enforced always? No. Is the ADA perfect? No. Is, you know, but also, like, is this just being taught? Are we learning about this? Are not the next generation learning about the history? No. And that's a problem.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. I, the same as you, was really blown away by learning about Judy Human, which I actually only did last year, really in the past like 6 months or so, when I came across her book, Being Human. And
Mhm.
I knew nothing about what she did, who she was, and the sit-ins, like you said, and all of this amazing campaigning and advocacy work that led to me as a young child in the States being able to grow up and not have any barriers to my day-to-day life. Like I was in a mainstream school, mainstream
Yep.
education. The only place that I wasn't able to physically access in the town where I grew up, I think it was a bakery for dogs, um, which is the most random business that happened to be in my little suburb at the time, but everywhere else was accessible to me. And then learning about the people who allowed that to be my reality, it was really incredible to hear about. But equally, when you look at Judy's story and the other advocates at the time, yes, there weren't laws in place to protect them, but were there experiences of discrimination that different from the instances of discrimination that I face all the time? I don't know if that resonates with you at all.
That does in many ways. And I actually don't think that's a question that I've really considered because I think you are 100% right. I think that in terms of the discrimination that we still face, I think a lot of it is the same discrimination that the older generation faced and was fighting to get those laws to protect. Again, it shows that like the ADA isn't perfect, isn't and it isn't the easiest law to get enforced, and that there's still the disability rights movement didn't end with the passage of the ADA.
So, in terms of growing up as an American, you said you're 28 right now.
Mhm.
Like, how do you find this is such a big question, so please take it wherever you want
Yeah.
to take it, but what do you feel is your experience of being a disabled adult in now 2024? Do you feel that there are still so many instances of discrimination, microaggressions, and all of those things, or do you feel the opposite?
Very much the former. I still feel very frustrated. I think the only difference between how I grew up and how I see the world now is I understand why. I think, and I talk about this a lot, it's saying like I learned how to be an advocate in terms of like the actual skills from my parents. Both my parents are average height, non-disabled, and they're both lawyers, which I think definitely played a part in it as well. But like I
Mhm.
remember going to school with them at the beginning of the school year and just watching them, not fully understanding what I was seeing, but just watching them advocate for me and making sure that the classroom was as accessible as it could be. And there were fights that they lost in the sense that they in some ways the school gave me too many accommodations that what my parents wanted, and in other ways we didn't get the exact accommodations that we were asking for. But watching them do it and because it remember it got to a point where the onus was on me to make sure that these needs were met. I was the one to make sure that I got my second set of books and that I would be the one who every class would have to take the second set of books down to the guidance counselor's office to make sure that they were ready for my mom to pick up for me because they wouldn't do that anymore. The school would like it was on me to make sure that got done. And it was interesting because at the same time, first, like, my parents got accommodations that I didn't necessarily need, and they didn't necessarily want me to have because they wanted me to still maintain independence. And I then had that resistance in middle school, and I think it was, like, trying to fit in and be like everybody else.
Mm.
And I saw these accommodations, and I think the way the accommodations are kind of viewed now still as special treatment. As a way to make
Mm.
you stand out in a way that's not positive, and I didn't want it. I truly like, in some ways refused it. I said, like, within the next day, like, "I don't want this. I would rather sit in a chair where my feet dangle if it meant that I gotta sit at a normal desk like everybody else." There's some things that I couldn't give up because I had to make it to class on time, so I had to leave a couple minutes early when needed. I had a different desk with a different chair, and it was different than everybody else, and that also meant that I couldn't move. Like, my desk was there. Everybody else switched seats every now and then. My chair stayed in the same spot. And so I didn't want that. And I said, no, I don't want this anymore. And it wasn't because I didn't need it. It was because I didn't want to stand out. I didn't want to be more different than I already was. And I think even now it's, with like this kind of like more like in the lens of asking for help. I don't like doing that. I don't like asking for help, even if I need it. I don't like doing it because I don't want to reinforce what somebody else already thinks about my disability or my dwarfism. Because I think I that's a whole other conversation of whether or not I think people actually see me as disabled. That's a whole separate other conversation. But I think that's how it evolves. Like I became more aware of what it was I needed, what it was I was asking for, and really like how the world saw me and treated me because of who I was physically.
That's so interesting. And I do want to ask, what other types of accommodations did you sort of push back on? Because I think a lot of my listeners who are UK based, I would say, from my knowledge of the UK school system, so I did the first 2 years of high school in America, and I moved to the UK when I was 16. So I did 2 years of school here before I went to uni. And I don't think that the UK integrates disability into mainstream schools all that well. And I'm just sort of thinking, yeah, that people might be wondering, what type of accommodation did you get? And this mindset that listeners might have of going in the UK, it's so difficult to get any sort of
Yeah.
adjustments. And and this is absolutely no criticism, someone who's getting the adjustments and then doesn't want it. I couldn't resonate with that more because I so often to this day, and it's stupid, but I do it as well, push back on help because you don't want to be a fuss, you don't want to be a bother, you don't want to, like you say, you don't want to stand out, even though
Yeah.
we quite obviously do because our disabilities are very visible, but that sort of, yeah, that difference is, it feels so big sometimes. Is there anything we can do to push back on that? I totally get why you do that.
Yep. Yeah, and it's like and I recognize that with my disability that I had the privilege of being able to push back, and it's interesting because I pushed back on when I was younger on the same accommodations I now ask my employer to give me. One was getting a certain kind of chair to sit at my desk, and when I was younger, that meant I had to have, again, like, a different desk than everybody else. And oddly enough, though, if I ever serves and if my mom's listening, I'm sure she'll tell me I was wrong because that's what mothers do.
Yeah,
Um,
you're never right, trust me.
the chair, so I got this chair that we saw that, like, LPA, Little People of America, we have an expo every year. They also provide resources for different adaptive products. So that's where we learned how to adapt our home to the best of our ability. So that way it was accessible for one little person and three people of average height without fully like inconveniencing someone, either myself or my brother or my parents, although I did leave stools everywhere. So they recommended that this chair that had a built-in footrest and was more suited for supporting our body, making sure our back was supported and our feet were supported, which is like the two biggest things that we really want to try to make sure of with our disability that happens. In third grade, we start taking keyboarding class and it's a computer lab. And so that was the best chair that they could provide for me to have in that classroom because I think in the other chairs, my feet would have still dangled without like, even if there's a stool underneath, I don't think my feet would have been able to touch because
Mm.
for the most part in elementary school, I just sat with my chair and I had a stool under my feet. So the chair was a solution for that. And then in middle school, my vice principal at the time, who was truly one of the greatest, nicest, kindest people, who was so understanding and so caring and very much listened to us and was very much made sure that what I needed was my needs were met. I think though he took it upon himself. I don't remember the exact details, but then suddenly that meant I had a chair in that chair in every classroom. And but like I saw it as like a way for me to stand out in a way that in middle school where you're really trying to fit in, same thing with like trying to fit in with fashion. I didn't want that. I truly didn't want this. So I was like, I think the biggest thing that I really pushed back against and said, I want to sit at a normal desk. I want to be able to, if the teacher is moving everybody's seats around, I want to be included in that. And so 7th grade, I didn't have that chair anymore. And I think that was like the big one. And then like in middle school and high school, again, was like with the books, it was like me making sure that I got the books that I needed, that they were provided, that I would go to the teachers and have to say, I need a second set of books. And they'd be like, okay, fine, take it down to the guidance counselor and have my mom pick it up. And that's what she did, or my dad. But yeah, I think it goes into this not it's hard, like, with wanting to and again, recognizing that I had the privilege to be able to do this, trying to fit in when you were literally born to stand out, it's very hard to do, and I was at the point when this was us like, showing that I didn't fully understand that I was disabled and that I really did need these things, that my body needed these things. It was just wanting to be as normal as I possibly could be, and not feeling that I was protected by these laws, not understanding what these laws were, and also not understanding what had to happen in order for me to get these accommodations.
Yeah, I completely see that. I think, and I wonder, as an adult now, do you feel like you're better at accepting what your body actually does need?
Yes, 100%, I'm much better at accepting what it needs. I'm not better at accepting its limitations. I think that is something I may never fully get. I'm always, like, wanting to challenge and wanting to test my own capabilities and see, obviously recognizing that there are limitations that I really do have to accept, but also like questioning limitations and why are they in place? And is it really something that I can't or shouldn't do? Or is it something that people believe I shouldn't do? Because if that's the case, then I'm like, no, let's challenge that. But I think now it's, and with coming into my identity as disabled, I'm much more, again, like in the workplace, I'm now asking, I was able to ask and to receive that chair and the and also recognizing that it is a in some ways it is, while yes, by law they were required to make those accommodations, like the easiness with in which that process happened, I do recognize is a privilege for at
Yeah,
least in the states that it was like that my supervisor was immediately like, okay, let's get this done, put me in touch with the right people and they went above and beyond what I was asking for, like, what I knew we could do. So that was, again, unexpected. But I think now, especially with the podcast and everything when you talk about, like, I'm much more willing and able to accept accommodations and also recognize that there are things I can't do and that I'm not gonna always fit in, and that's okay.
do you feel like there's a distinction, though, between asking for accommodation and advocating for yourself more in the workplace than in
Mhm.
day-to-day life and, like,
Yeah.
and with social lives as well?
Yeah, I think it goes into I think I see asking for accommodations and asking for help in some ways are different 'cause I think in the sense that in social situations, I'm very reluctant to ask my friends for help for something or even strangers in a grocery store. I'm very reluctant to ask for help. And there are some places where I'm in like public spaces where accommodations can be made where I'm still reluctant to necessarily ask for it, but at the same time, I will also point out how they are very inaccessible. So I need to work on that.
No,
But I
but I get that, right? Like, I really do get wanting to challenge things that could make things easier, but also not wanting to accept help, which also makes things easier.
yeah, and it's in those situations, it's more seeing that my accommodation would be an inconvenience to those around me. And I did this a lot, like using in an example. And it's interesting because I talk again, this is an industry that I love that I say all the time is very inaccessible, which is like the theater, which is like Broadway. And I love Broadway, grew up going to theater, still waiting to see myself on Broadway, but that will continue advocating for that.
I
But
mean,
the
one day I will be
one day,
in that front row.
yes, but there's one accommodation like I forget is like getting a booster, so I could see more of the theater. Which oddly enough, I was having conversations with somebody about this. I think on my podcast or like in general, with someone else like in a theater community, realizing that my accommodation helps me see, but doesn't necessarily help my body in the sense that it makes my feet even higher from the floor, which I didn't think about because someone pointed that out to me, and I was like, "Huh, now that's something I'm gonna consider for a little bit." But I would for a long time, like, I wouldn't ask for a booster because I thought then I would be too tall, I would be blocking other people's view, but my
You'd
view would still be
be
blocked. Just before I see who's around me, just go in and say, "I need this." So, like, something like that. So, yeah, it's very interesting in situations, but I think accommodations for the most part more willing to ask for. It's the asking for help. And even just like simple social situations of like asking somebody to slow down, asking a friend to slow down. I am really
mm,
bad at doing that. And I get called out for that by people who rightfully should call me out for that. But I think it's very interesting how, with what things I will be okay with asking for, and in what situations and what help I need, I won't ask for.
is it the impact on other people that you think is the factor? Like you said, sort of inconveniencing someone by being now the person who might be obstructing someone's view or having a friend change their walking speed. Do you think that's the fact, like a big factor in that?
100%. I think it's feeling like an inconvenience, feeling and I think part of it's because like, that's happened to me. There's been instances of that in the past where I have asked for it, and then I was treated a certain way that I didn't like. So,
Okay.
not wanting to feel like that again, I'm more reluctant to do it or not feeling like not knowing how they're gonna react if I do ask for it, or also, like, in some ways, it's like a frustration that, like, I shouldn't have to ask for this. Like, you
Yeah.
should like, in certain situations, so then not wanting to ask for it because you feel like you shouldn't have to. So, it's like the whole concept of, ooh, that could be like having to ask for help when you're disabled or ask for accommodations. It's not as simple as it seems from many perspectives. It's not even just simple, like just truly like, does the law allow you? Should you be legally required to get these accommodations met? It's a lot more than that that I don't think is necessarily talked about really.
And I want to go on from that, but talking about, like you said, how these things should already be in place. There should be, you shouldn't have to ask for
Yeah.
things and worrying about other people's reactions. And reading your blog and sort of like looking at the conversations that you've had. And I particularly, was reading the transcript of your solo episode about turning 28, and you talk a lot about representation. And we've talked about that, right? In terms of
Yeah.
fashion, but also you talk about it in terms of the media, like you've talked about The Wizard of Oz, which I really want to get into, and other ways that your disability is represented in media. And I want to ask you because I think there are some people who will think that inclusion is sometimes, and I don't agree with this at all, but there are some people who think, oh, that's going too far in terms of inclusion. So
Yeah.
having a little person during New York Fashion Week or having a disabled character in a TV show. And yeah, I just wondering, like, how do you feel about because I could imagine in your example of the theater with the booster seat, and you said about worrying about other people's reactions, would that person behind you who might be annoyed think like, oh, this is going too far by accommodating you, it then inconveniences me. But yeah, what are your thoughts on
It's interesting you asked this question because do you know Sophie Morgan?
I do, yeah. I
Okay.
mean, not personally,
Like, no,
but I know of
yeah,
her incredible work, yeah.
she's incredible. I had her on the podcast, and she had said something that started this conversation in terms of the differences between the US and the UK. And I think disability representation, because I see the UK from a disability perspective as being ahead of the US, at least in terms of real
Oh,
representation. And she like, because she was saying like how like in the US things are more accessible, like from like the leak, like from with the ADA
yeah,
and everything like that. So, and why I said that is because we don't have, there isn't like a Sophie Morgan who's a presenter, like a normal, like in terms of like normal, in terms of like frequent presenter on mainstream television. We don't have that. We don't have British Vogue had Sinead Burke on the cover. British Vogue had their disability issue last year. American Vogue hasn't had that. Um, and so like in terms of representation of just seeing it and having it just be more normalized from my perspective, I'm not going to speak for everybody. Like I saw, it was like the UK is ahead of the US on that. And like seeing like with Doctor Who, with Ruth Madeley's character. I don't watch Doctor Who, but I'm like supporting her 100% and like seeing that representation. Like the US has made strides, but I think there's a lot of catching up to do. And also like, so that's kind of like, this was interesting that you say it because like I think, that's really where for me those differences lie. But yeah, it's I never thought of being like going that's too far, but I think that is 100% true. I think with like being when we ask say we want to see this, a lot of the pushback is that's too far or that's too complicated or that's too hard or we don't want to do it wrong, so they
so
decide that the
just
answer is to not do it. And I want to be like, no, that should never be the answer. That should never, in terms of in the conversation around representation, never be the answer. Just to say, well, out of fear of doing it wrong, I don't want to do it. However, there are some instances of disability representation, and I'm thinking specific representation of little people where it's clear and it's been made clear that this isn't okay. When that happens, then it's don't do. Then say rather than continuing to go in this wrong direction, let's pivot. Let's listen to the little people telling us what they want to see. Let's listen to the community when they say that this is wrong, this is offensive, this is perpetuating harmful stereotypes, which the community has been trying to challenge and change. I got in trouble for saying this then when I said on something like representation and is everything, but I do stand by it because I think if we don't see disability on our screens in a magazine, if we don't see it, then allows it to be ignored in spaces where it really can't be. So I think having that representation in that sense is everything. And I think representation is not just limited to the entertainment and fashion industries. I think disability representation is lacking in a lot of areas where it really needs to be present.
yeah, I completely agree because I think, like you said, if disability was everywhere, which it is, because there are so many disabled people, there's no way that you have no interaction with it. But by having it everywhere and by seeing it, because, like you say, it's not possible to like claim ignorance for not
Mhm.
doing something that is within your power to improve a situation for disabled people. And I think that goes particularly the first thing that's come to mind is politicians, right?
Yeah.
If we can't get politicians aware of disability and they're choosing to not engage with it and they're not seeing it, then how are they ever going to legislate or put in place schemes, programs, whatever that serve disabled people and allow us to have equal chances, opportunities, and all of that. So I think that's incredibly important. But I'm so interested that you think that the UK is better in terms of representation because I think that I agree in a sense because there are instances of disability, like you say, in Doctor Who and other places, but What I wanted to ask you about is the inclusion of people with dwarfism because I
Mhm.
can only speak as a wheelchair user. And I think when people think of inclusive representation when it comes to disability, it's sort of like, oh, slap a wheelchair user. And
Yes.
because it's really easy, or it's also really easy to fake. And when we've all seen
Yeah.
like pictures where we know that the stock photo, that person is not actually a wheelchair user. But
Mhm.
what do you feel are the perceptions and sort of the ways that dwarfism is depicted?
We are either seen as tools for education, and I'll say that in a positive way. I think the reality TV shows such as Little People Big World, The Little Couple, Seven Little Johnsons, I think are examples of positive dwarfism representation because they show what it is really like to be a little person in this world. It's not every dwarfism experience. I myself resisted watching those shows at first because I said those shows don't reflect my experience as the only little person in my world. But I do think they show without necessarily putting an inspiration porn lens on it, what it's really like to
Mm,
be a little person. But we're either at so like it's like education. So we're either that or we are, with several exceptions, I will say that, and obviously the one notable one being Peter Dinklage. We are objects of entertainment, of amusement. We are human-like rather than human, and I mean, we're seeing it right now. Uh, well, I guess we could talk about it because, like, the strike is over, the Wonka movie came out, and we saw Hugh Grant as an Oompa Loompa, and I will say I'll confess I haven't seen the movie, but I don't want to see the movie based off of the trailer and based off of what I heard both Hugh Grant and the director say about the decisions that were made, as well as some
mhm.
other behind like, not interested.
What are those comments for people who aren't familiar?
That basically, like, there was no it was made to seem like there was no possibility that they were actually gonna cast a little person. The director made it seem like, of course, they're gonna cast Hugh Grant because he is I think he said, like, little shit or something funny little shit or something, and that was what they were looking for with this character. And then knowing that to make Hugh Grant laugh, which Hugh Grant talked about, the director during, like, the renderings of, like, developing the character sent a nude version of this character just to kinda, like, for amusement. And it's just like, what? Like and, like, to be
Mm,
open like, that open to just talk about it and think that there's nothing wrong with that or that the little person community because in essence, you're saying you're sharing, even if it's AI generated like, nude pic of a dwarf body. What are we doing here? So there's that. And then there is Snow White, which is coming out now next year. And Peter Dinklage said when it was announced who was going to be Snow White, that Rachel Zegler was gonna be Snow White, Peter Dinklage had gone on a podcast and called out Disney for trying to score diversity points. And I want to make it very clear, he had no problem with Rachel Zegler being cast as Snow White. He had absolutely no problem with it. That was not the issue. The issue was that they were trying to score diversity points while at the same time telling a story that was going to continue to perpetuate harmful stereotypes of little people. And he's like, that is uncalled for. And what he said got very much misconstrued. So I do want to like kind of like make that clear that he did not take away jobs from little people. He did not do that with what he said. Not at all. But then fast forward to last year, a picture went viral that was leaked from the set, unofficial. It's not clear what it was of the Snow White and the seven dwarves, except there was one little person and the rest were all of average height. And the internet did not like that at all. And for me, seeing that and seeing the reaction to it again, first having to say, like, because then a lot of Little People actors were, like, blaming Peter Dinklage for this when he does not deserve any of the blame for it. But also, like, failing to recognize the true problem here. And I'm like, "You're mad because this challenges your belief system of what the 7 dwarfs could be, and if you don't wanna challenge it because you wanna be able to keep this perpetuate it. You wanna keep it going. It's hard to make fun of the 7 dwarfs if 6 of them look like non-disabled average height people. It's hard to do that." And so, like, that photo was leaked. Disney said, like, it's unofficial. It's not clear what that photo was. But then I think when they announced that they were pushing the film release back a year, they released a photo, like an official photo, and the 7 dwarfs look animated, look like not great, in my opinion, CGI. And I'm just
Mhm.
like, because Disney tried to say, like, we're going in a different direction. We consulted the little person community before doing this, like, in terms of how we approach these characters. And I saw this, I'm like, "So what exactly did you learn?" That's my question, was seeing what this one result is. Obviously, the film hasn't come out yet, but I was, like, looking, I'm like, "So what exactly did you learn from these little people that you consulted?" Because I'm like, it's reinforcing what Peter Dinklage was saying from all along, that you're telling a story that is going to continually perpetuate this harmful stereotype that dwarves are these, like, they don't have names. They Like, it's just like, what are we doing? It's like, in terms of
Mm.
dwarfism represent it's just what is happening? I guess that's, like, my question.
I s Something that's just come to mind as you were talking is that I never realized was being a little person and using the term dwarfism, when a dwarf can also be thought of as this, like, mythical creature, right? Like a leprechaun, a dwarf, a goblin, a unicorn. Like
Mhm.
it's like you say, it's something that's not human, but there are humans who live with dwarfism. So it is,
Yep.
how did that happen? Was it, like you say, when little people and all of these like freaks, for lack of a better expression, because of freak shows, right? Like,
Right.
The Greatest Showman, Phantom of the Opera, like those types of scenarios did happen where people would come and look at people who look different and laugh. But how do you feel as someone living with dwarfism when a dwarf can also be this non-human creature, is that the right term?
Yeah. I think that's correct, and it's frustrating, and, like, that's why I said, like, when I introduced myself, like, kind of explained, like, I said, "I'm a little person or dwarf," and that's really how I explain myself in general. I always say both because I know that people have a concept of what a dwarf is, and that concept is often not human. And I'll say, like, the objectification and dehumanization of people with dwarfism goes back centuries. This is not new. And there's a really great podcast and content creator, Aubrey Smalls. He has a podcast, Dwarfism History, and a lot of his content does really examine it. And it's really great. And I highly suggest people follow and listen. So that's not new. But so I'll say I'm a dwarf or a little person because dwarfism is my diagnosis. I'm medically a dwarf. But because of these preconceived notions of what a dwarf is that aren't human, I have to say little person. And the problem not problem with that, but, like, something that someone pointed out recently is, like, they'll say I'm a little person or a dwarf to challenge what it means to be a little person in the sense that we refer to children as little people. Children are little. Adults are not little. So having to describe ourselves as a little person, what does that mean? And I never thought of it like that. So it's like, how do we define ourselves in a way that doesn't get us treated like a child or like a mythical creature or less than human? And that shouldn't be a question that we as humans have to answer. Like, that shouldn't be a debate. Like, it shouldn't be, and that's also something that shouldn't be on us to have to try to explain. That shouldn't be on us.
I'm just sort of like mulling over the conversation and this realization of, what it means. And I hate it when people try to weaponize your own self-identifying
Yeah.
language and try and make you feel like you should be using a different term to describe yourself because it might make them clearer, it might make them like more comfortable, whatever it might be. And I've had that a lot with living in the US, where you would say a person with a disability. I used that term in a tweet when I was relatively new to the disability activism space, and someone sent me a long, not very nice email about why I shouldn't be using the term person with a disability. I should be using disabled person because that follows what the language that they use in the UK, which is around the social model of
Okay.
disability. And I respect that is the terminology, but I was also describing myself. So I
Right.
feel like give us the freedom to describe ourselves and our impairment how we want to without trying to turn it into something that reflects on you in any way.
Exactly. I'm just like baffled at that because like to me, I see that like the person with a disability versus disabled person, like that's just how that's like more of a language issue of whether you identify as use identity first or person first language. Like that's not like they both mean the same thing.
It it was a huge surprise to me
Yeah.
to receive that email, and I've been extremely conscious of it since, and now it's become second nature because of the field that I work in, which is disability in the charity sector. So I will now try and correct people on that language or educate them rather, I should say, instead of correct. It's sort of correct, but here's why. But to describe
Right.
yourself, I think you should be given the freedom to use the language that makes you feel comfortable. And yeah, I think it's just so interesting how people will interpret, try and dance around language with
Yeah.
disabilities. We've all seen the memes like differently abled or less
Mhm.
abled. And I feel to try and make other people more like, feel like they're saying the right thing because they're not outright saying that you have a disability when, like you say, we do. We have a medical diagnosis of
Right.
a condition. We can call it what we want in terms of, you say person first or identity first language, but ultimately we do have a disability. So let's not pretend like we don't or that it's not a part of who we are because it's
Right.
the same that any other bit of your identity impacts who you are.
Exactly. Calling us disabled is not an insult.
So what do you if you were the director of the new Snow White movie, how would you want to see that approached? Which I know is a huge question that is outside of probably your scope. I don't think you're
I
a
mean,
famous film director, but if you were, that'd be sick.
I would say I'm not making this movie. I think I would say this movie has we have Snow White, which like it or not, the original, like it or not, that movie is cinematically important. It's the first animated film. It's, for the time, it's well done, in my opinion. I would say I'm not making this film. I think but I recognize I'm saying that as a little person director. If I was approaching it though, assuming that I was the director from this, I would try to I would say, "Fine, but I'm going to treat these characters as human. I'm going to cast little people actors. They are going to have names. They can have the emotions that these characters have. So whether that is dopey, which I might change that one, happy, grumpy, they can have those emotions, but they're gonna have real names. They're not going to be these helpless individuals. We're gonna really humanize them and say, like, they are minors. Explore that. Like, really show the humanity in these characters. If we're saying that they are human, then we're going to treat them as humans because I feel
Mhm.
like with the Seven Dwarfs from the 1937, they're humans, but they're not treated like humans. So they're again, that's like human like. So
Yeah,
I think that
and
would be the approach I would have to it. But I would then also say, you know, it's 2024. It's so weird. I keep wanting to say it's 2023. It's not.
yeah,
Um,
me too.
we have seen what happens when we diversify our concept of who a Disney princess is. We saw it with Little Mermaid, with Halle Bailey as Ariel, and the reaction that got from young Black girls who were able to say, like, we have our princess, we see ourselves, and the power that we're seeing it with Asha in Wish, which I will confess is a movie I haven't seen, but I've seen the reactions to it. We saw it with the live action Mulan, with like when we see these roles that we typically see as one way, but being cast, saying that there isn't really a limit to who these persons could be, like, I would say that needs to apply to disability too. We need our disabled Disney princess because there are young disabled girls who are still waiting for their Disney princess, who want to see disability be royal, be regal. What are we waiting for? There's tons of disabled talent out there who would love to do that part, who would love to tell that story, who know how to tell that story. Give them the platform instead of retelling a story where you're perpetuating harmful stereotypes. What it's like again, like referring back to what Peter Dinklage, you can't want to try to score points while at the same time doing harm. It doesn't work like that. It shouldn't work
Yeah,
like that.
and that's what I was thinking when you were talking about Snow White is that they and I know the actress got, like, a bit of flack, and that is probably an understatement, but for saying, "Oh, it's 2023, she doesn't need to be rescued," all of that type of stuff. So if they're going to try and, quote, unquote, like, not revolutionize, but, like, modernize what who Snow White is, then why can't they do that in a sensitive way to disability and disability
Yeah.
representation? And I feel that I talk about this on, like, my social media a lot, and I've mentioned this with Peter Dinklage characters as well, is that so often disabled people in media, if they're in the mainstream movie, it'll either be as an object of pity, which I think
Mhm.
is probably in, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that leans towards the wheelchair users, and
Yeah.
I think or they are depicted as a villain, and I know that
Yes.
Pete and I haven't seen the new Hunger Games film, but I know that Peter Dinklage is a villain-esque kinda character in there, like, I think
I
he,
think I haven't seen it either.
yeah, I think I read somewhere that he creates the Hunger Games, which is
Okay.
creating a TV spectacle where teenagers kill each other. And I don't know if that sort of rings true to you. We talked about how dwarfism you feel is represented as either human-like. Do you feel like those two representations of disability resonate with how you view media?
I do, and I completely agree. I think that often the disability, and I'm not referring to just dwarfism. Oddly enough, I'll say dwarfism is rarely seen as more of like the pitiful character. Rarely. I'm not saying that it's not often, but I think in terms of like when we see like when it's disabilities treated like that, it's very rarely a little person in that role. No, I think you're 100% right. And Peter Dinklage is an interesting example of just of disability representation in general, because he has said from the beginning, and I don't think people with talking about him now fully understand that he said from the beginning he was not going to take on roles that played into the stereotypes. That wasn't something he then was able to say once he became Peter Dinklage. That was his mindset from the beginning. He just got incredibly lucky with the roles that he was able to get. And the one role that comes to mind where I think the character, I don't want to say falls into that victim category, but is treated in some ways like is like victimized or is, but it's very real, is the station agent, which is like his big break. Character is really treated the way people with dwarfism are treated in the real world, where they are, in some instances, humiliated, they are insulted, they are mocked. And while, yes, that character is in some way being victimized, it's very real. And that role really made him. But he said from the beginning, I'm not going to take on parts where I'm playing an elf. I'm not going to play one of the seven dwarfs. I'm not going to do these roles. He'll be in fantasy, but he's not going to do those kinds of roles. And it's interesting because I know that I didn't read all of the books. I tried and I just couldn't do it. With like Game of Thrones, with Tyrion, I think that the representation of Tyrion that he portrayed is different from the books in the sense that he took away some of those more stereotypical parts to the character as he is portrayed in the book and made and grounded him more. But yet he's still a character who will call himself an imp. But he says, I do that so people can't use it against me. And so I think
Mm.
that it's a very interesting, his career is like just very interesting to see from like the representation perspective. But it's always lost that people think that he was able to take this stance that he takes all the time once he became Peter Dinklage, like once he got Tyrion. But it's like failing to recognize like, no, that was always his approach to his career, that he was never going to take those roles. He just got incredibly lucky and is also incredibly talented that he was able to do that.
Yeah, he is a fantastic actor, like, there is absolutely no denying it, but the I personally didn't know that about his stance when he started in the career, because when you said he's not going to play an elf, of course, Christmas was fairly recently, and Elf is one of the big Christmas films, and he plays a character who gets called an elf, and by Buddy the Elf, who, not a real human, but it physically attacks him for calling him an elf, which I think is it's really interesting, but it's now thinking about it a bit more seriously, is making a point, isn't it? It's that, yes, this is the joke of the scene, but the point is that he is this incredible, you know, children's book author, illustrator, whatever, and he's being taken incredibly seriously by the other non-disabled characters in the scene. But he gets called an elf, attacks him, and then leaves because he's gonna not be treated that way. I've never analyzed sort of his inclusion in that film in a serious way, but does that sort of feel like how you've understood it?
Yeah, I saw because Elf is an interesting, and Elf, I think people try to bring up to say, no, he did this. Like he's called an elf, but it's like he
Mm,
doesn't accept that. Like he stands up for himself. Yes, he
mm,
does it in a way that is somewhat comical, but I do think that anyone pushed to their breaking point, if that was an average height actor getting repeatedly insulted and then decided, like, nobody would throw an issue with it. Even in a comedy, nobody would have an issue with it or would still think it's funny. But people like to, I think with Elf that stands still firmly in his humanity. He's like, I'm not an elf. Don't call me that.
yeah,
Don't,
and
I'm a human. I'm the boss in this situation. I'm in like,
mm,
has the most power in that room. Um, So, yeah, Elf is always like, I think
yeah.
people try to, like, say, like, "Well, like, he did," and it's like, "No, no, watch
No,
that
because
scene, watch the movie."
yeah.
He doesn't allow himself to be called an elf. He doesn't allow himself to be treated like an elf.
No, you're right. He is the one with the most power in that room, so much so that they are begging him, paying him whatever he wants to come in and save their asses, essentially. And he does leave, and they end up ripping off his idea, or they try to, which is not great. But it
Right.
shows that what the non-disabled characters in that scene value is his mind, his expertise, and his career. And
Right.
I think it's really quite interesting when you think about it in light of what you've told me about Peter Dinklage as an actor.
Yeah. I think it's the idea of like representation as a whole. I'll say like in every for a lot of instances of this, there's the one. So we have our one, so we're good. But it's like,
Yeah,
no, don't stop at your one. One is not enough. It's not enough in in representation in other ways. So it should not be enough in how you see disability. In the US, we really need to see disability in our media in the sense of not just reality TV, but more like news TV, more normalized and like the president like we don't have that here. And I think that is and same thing like with Dash, like in that like sense of like just seeing real representation of disability where they're not a character is something that we need to really like we need to catch up because we're not there yet.
yeah, I love seeing a disabled actor in a role when their disability isn't point. Like, it's not a factor of the scene. They just happen to be an amputee. They just happen to be a wheelchair user, and it's not the point of their inclusion
Exactly.
because it's not the entire point of our existence. Why should it be for media?
Exactly. Like being disabled as a whole, being a disabled person is only a part of, I think, like of who we are as individuals. But there are disabled activists, disabled writers, disabled people, doctors, disabled lawyers, and they see themselves as doctors, lawyers, etc. And it's their job title here. And they recognize that the disability is part of them, but it doesn't define them. And in some ways, in some instances, like that's not their main identifying trait or how they really want to see themselves and identify themselves as. It's more of what they do, what they're capable of.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that brings me to what is sadly probably our last question, although I'm aware, like, I could easily talk to you for
Like,
hours about
that
so
just
much
means
of
you need to
this.
come on my podcast. That's what's really gonna happen next.
Oh my god, I would love to, and this
Yes.
that beautifully segues me into when you said that you were going to do a bit more broad interview or solo episodes, etc., with Always Looking Up, but what are you hoping to do in 2024 with Always Looking Up?
I think the main goal with going into this year is I think with last year, it was more getting guests and, like, having conversations with people, like, diversifying my guests in terms of, like, different disabilities, different fields, different professions. And I think with this year, it's really diversifying my topics that we talk about and also really being less afraid to talk about subjects that I think in some instances non-disabled audiences aren't necessarily ready to hear, but in also instances where maybe disabled audiences aren't ready to hear or also maybe not necessarily examining conversations that are happening, but it's coming at them from a different perspective. So I think that's my big goal in terms of letting those limitations that I might have unconsciously put in place around, like, what we talk about, letting those go and really being more open in what we talk about, and in doing so, being able to continue diversifying who we get on the podcast and talking to people who really have a different life experience than I do and having a conversation, having a debate, and really amplifying those voices. Like, I always tell my guests, like, my podcast really isn't my space, it's theirs.
I am just, yeah, beyond excited to see what you do with the podcast this year and would highly recommend it to absolutely all of my listeners because I think it would just open them up to new, amazing disabled people that they haven't heard of and hear some incredibly important conversations. So, I just wanted now to say a huge, huge thank you to you for spending your Saturday with me and recording this. It's been just so much fun getting to know you.
Thank you. It was so lovely coming on. Thank you so much for inviting me. And yeah, you're gonna have to come on my podcast, and that's not a question.
I would love nothing more. So, everyone, stay tuned for that episode where we
Hmm.
flip the script.
Exactly.
Thank you for listening to the Wheelchair Activist podcast. You can learn more and stay updated by going to my website, thewheelchairactivist.com, and following me on social media. We will be back next month with a brand new episode.